Good evening, buenas tardes, and welcome to everyone joining us tonight for our webinar to discuss all things ocean around Galapagos. I'm Dr. Jen Jones, the interim CEO of GCT and your host this evening. I know that we have people tuning in from all over the world, which just goes to show how special this place is and how it continues to inspire and fascinate people long after they've been lucky enough to witness it in person. This evening, we'll be looking at how we protect marine species in Galapagos across their whole life cycles and how important it is to provide that protection from their time in their nursery environment all the way through to migrations into the open seas. But before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box. Please use this to submit your questions, and after the talks are finished, we will do our best to answer as many as we can. If we can't get around to your question, we do plan to do a follow-up email, and so we will do our best to get all of them answered if we can. By the end of this evening, I hope you're inspired to help us take the next step with this work. A huge thank you to all of you online now who've already supported us in this ocean protection work, but we couldn't do what we do without you lot. And so please, if you're in a position to help us with our ocean protection appeal to continue this work into the next years, we would be so grateful for any support that you can give. And I think links should appear in the chat for you to follow. So I saw a lot of familiar names on the participants list. Thank you very much for all of you who are already in our network who've joined. For those of you who are new to us, the Galapagos Conservation Trust is the only UK registered charity to focus solely on the conservation of the Galapagos Islands. Of course, one of the most unique and ecologically important areas in the world. We have two major streams of work. One on restoring islands, which works very closely with the local communities, and the other, which we're diving into this evening, protecting oceans. So for those of you who are lucky enough to have been to the Galapagos Islands, whether you are in the sea, on the sea, near the sea, you've probably seen some of the amazing species that call the Marine Reserve home. Now, due to the unique environmental conditions of Galapagos, so we have a big mix of ocean currents there, lots of differences in nutrients available, etc. We have some really interesting zonation in the Marine Reserve, which has enabled some very specific adaptations of species, many of which are found nowhere else on Earth. So this high incidence of endemic species in the marine realm is really unusual, as up to 20% of species we know are endemic to the Marine Reserve, again showing how special this is. And I know that we're going to meet some more of these characters later this evening. So our approach to ocean protection is one that's holistic. We have three major threats that we're concerned about. Climate change, of course, overfishing, so whether that's unsustainable fishing, illegal fishing, and pollution, primarily plastics, that we have a major program on that Jess Howard is going to give us an overview a bit later on. Now, the reason why we need to consider all of these threats together is because they interact with each other and quite often exacerbate the effects of the others. So for some examples, plastic has a huge carbon footprint along its whole supply chain. So even from when it's first produced, because it's primarily from oil, petrochemical, over 95% of plastic that's produced is still from that source. That has a huge carbon footprint, of course. And not many people realize, but if plastic degrades in the environment, it actually releases greenhouse gases back into the environment as well. So above the ecosystem damage we know that plastics do, they're contributing back to the problem of climate change. With the temperature changes in the ocean that are predicted from climate change, so many of you will be familiar with the El Nino event that happens every 7 to 10 years, particularly affecting this area in the Eastern Pacific. This we expect to become more regular and more severe with increasing climate change. And this further destabilizes the marine ecosystems. Overfishing and the removal of top predators of biomass is also having this effect as well of destabilizing the marine ecosystem, which we really do need to be stronger than ever if we're going to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So how will we do this? This photo was taken at Monaco Ocean Week last year that I was lucky enough to be presenting GCT's work on this topic. So here, of course, you can see a very familiar face on the left, Dr. Sylvia Earle, Her Royal Deepness, a huge ocean hero of mine, and I'm sure many of you joining us this evening. We were also there with Dr. Sarah Darwin. She is a GCT ambassador, and she was the one who came up with these 3 words, these 3 C's, for how we protect the seas, and they've really stuck with me since. Also on that photo, you can see me, of course, and Lena Harson, who works at the Prince Albert II Foundation, who generously sponsored this work before. So these 3 C's, starting with connections. So the ocean itself is a connected environment, and we'll hear many times this evening about what goes on outside of the marine reserve boundaries has a huge impact to the biodiversity within the marine reserve. So considering the environment is very connected is important. We also need to make connections between stakeholders that benefit from the oceans, that use the oceans, and we need to get out of our own bubbles of talking to similar-minded people. So we aim to make connections between other NGOs, between marine managers, industry, policymakers, to really get these networks behind ocean protection at the level we need to make a difference. And this, of course, then we hope comes into fruitful collaborations. But to do this, we really need courage. There's some big, bold steps that are needed to really achieve this ocean protection, particularly agreements between countries and looking at these international movements that are starting. So you may be familiar with the 30 by 30 concept. This was a recommendation from many marine scientists that if we can protect at least 30% of the global ocean, we have a chance of ensuring a degree of stability in the marine ecosystems that can help us to mitigate these worst effects of climate change. The reason why ocean protection has a link there is a process called blue carbon that I think we will also hear a bit more about later too. So the ocean and the creatures that live within it have a huge role in sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And basically, these processes are one of our best kind of nature-based solutions against to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So ocean protection really will make a huge difference in the future. In Galapagos, 25 years ago, the Marine Reserve was first established, protecting an area of 133,000 kilometers squared. At the time, I believe this was the 2nd biggest marine reserve that existed in the world. So Ecuador was leading the way. Just last year, the new Hermandad Marine Reserve was established, adding an extra 60,000 kilometers squared of protection. But now it's our challenge to find out how can we support the Ecuadorian government to protect that further 110,000 kilometers squared to get them to 30% and to advise where that should be. So one of our major tools really to effectively designate these areas is to follow migratory animals. This map was made by our colleagues at Migromar who track many different types of species, and the Galapagos Whale Shark Project is a close collaborator as well. So this network of scientists in the Eastern Pacific follow all kinds of migratory species, whales, turtles, sharks, and even seabirds to see how they use this region. And also we then want to learn how they are interacting with threats. So whether that's directly with fishing fleets, whether that's with plastic pollution, whether that's with shipping collisions, whether that's with where we predict ocean currents might change in the future. This movement data is really essential for making these top level decisions of where we protect next in the ocean. Species, of course, don't know where these protection boundaries lie, and pollution certainly doesn't either. And so, as I mentioned, Jess later is going to take us through our work on plastics and what we're doing in this bigger region to have an impact on this very topical topic. For us, it's very much linked with oceans protection because globally, it's estimated coastal plastic pollution is about 20% from maritime sources. From our data in Galapagos so far, at least 40% is coming from maritime sources, and I expect that's probably an underestimate. So if we can handle getting in there with the fisheries, with the shipping companies to improve their waste management and to put decent traceability on gears to reduce the threat of ghost gears, so we'll hear more about that later too, then we will be making a huge difference to the amount of plastic that we're finding in the marine environment that's having an impact on these unique species. So I'm just going to round off this intro with some words from our hero, Dr. Sylvia Earle, when we were on an expedition last year with her NGO Mission Blue. So some of her words about why it matters to protect the ocean around Galapagos.
Why protect the Galapagos Islands on the land and in the sea? Well, I've heard people say, if you can't protect the Galapagos, what can you protect? This is a World Heritage area, land and sea. Most of the land is protected as a national park for Ecuador. There's growing support for protecting the ocean too, to look at the creatures of the ocean for what they are, wild animals, and to regard them with the same kind of respect that we have come to have for the iguanas and the flightless cormorants and for the other special creatures that are unique to the Galapagos Islands, because they're animals underwater that are unique to the Galapagos too. And all of the pieces are needed in order to maintain the health, not just of this treasured part of the planet, but as an example of what we need to do for the whole planet, to treat nature as if our lives depend on it, because now we know they do.
Thank you for listening to the intro so far. Thanks again for joining us. Next up, I want to introduce our amazing daughter-father team from the Galapagos Whale Shark Project. Jonathan Green has worked with us for many years and in Galapagos for nearly 3 decades, making several thousand dives in the Marine Reserve. So I think Jonathan would have a story of any species that you could name in the Marine Reserve. And after an early fascination with whale sharks, he founded the Galapagos Whale Shark Project along with Alex Hearn to better understand how these amazing animals interact with the Galapagos Marine Reserve and what part the islands play in their life cycle. Sophia is an Ecuadorian marine biologist and has worked for several years tagging whale sharks and carrying out fieldwork of all kinds. She's also does some amazing work with education programs, and I think that is worth a massive shout out, Sophie, for the work that you do inspiring young girls on the island, particularly who are keen to follow careers in science and conservation. So without further ado, I will pass over to Sophie and Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. It seems like my dad is here. Are you there? He says he's lost internet, but let's see if he wants to unmute. Otherwise, I'll take over from this point.
Might have to join again. Yeah, I didn't mention in my intro that Jonathan is kindly joining us from Costa Rica, and Sophia is actually in the Galapagos Islands right now with phenomenal internet connection. So we're very relieved about that, Sophie. Back to you.
No, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and start. Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. It truly is important to mention that every single bit has to work together for us to be able to protect the oceans. And that is what we kind of try and work with the Galapagos Whale Shark Project again, as well, as we try to discover the greatest ocean mystery. And that is how things work with whale sharks in the ocean. I'll let you know a little bit about the project's history. It began with my dad and a few divers who started in the 1990s, noticing that there was an aggregation that they were finding up in the north in Darwin Island, and seeing that these whale sharks that were coming, as nobody knew anything about them. My dad started asking around and everyone was like, oh, it's the same three that are circling around. Oh, they must be these massive males, you know, because they're so big that everyone imagined they must be males. So he started asking questions, and the more that he asked, the more he realized that this was not exactly how people thought it was. It was migratory whale sharks, new whale sharks coming in every day. They were actually massive females, and then started discovering a little bit more. And it wasn't until 2005 where they actually developed the project with Dr. Alex Hearn to be able to start studying this amazing species in the Galapagos Islands. This here, the unique flora and fauna, is what people... Hi, are you back? Yes, go ahead.
I'm very sorry who's watching us. I'm in a rather remote place on the planet, and internet is not something we can depend on very often. So sorry to have lost you there briefly. Hopefully it's just, as I say, a brief interim. I think when people talk about Galapagos, this is what they associate immediately. Giant tortoises, volcanic landscapes, Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution. But obviously, there's a lot more to it. The underwater world is something which was never really explored a great deal by Darwin and by the early explorers. But increasingly in Galapagos, we've become aware of the diversity and the uniqueness of the underwater world. Next. So Galapagos is a place where you can find a huge diversity of wildlife, species that you don't necessarily see commonly, like penguins, for example. Jen already mentioned the fact that this is a crossroads for currents. So you get very, very cold water flooding in from the south, warm water flooding in from the north. And because of that, you have this incredible combination of wildlife. You might see penguins in one snorkeling area at the same time as you're snorkeling or diving with marine iguanas. And these are the only true marine lizards world. So the diversity is very high. And as Jen also mentioned earlier on, the endemic percentage is very high. Between the land and the oceans, it could be between 30 and 40% of all wildlife, flora, fauna is actually endemic and unique to the Galapagos Islands. At the same time as cold water species, you have hot water species. So you can be swimming with parrotfish and penguins at the same time. So Galapagos is totally unique. Delving a little bit deeper into the waters, for many people, they've not had the opportunity to dive with whale sharks. And if you look at the following images, the following video, the next slide, just to answer a quick question there, you have to excuse me, I'm just jumping in. So to answer a quick question there, we often get asked, is it a whale or is it a shark? For many people, that's very clear, but for a lot, it's something which is quite confusing. Whale sharks, of course, are fish. They're not mammals, but they do have the behavior of whales to a certain extent. They come to the surface. They often forage in surface waters. We see them fairly frequently on the surface, and they give birth to live young, but they're incubating their eggs internally. The classification of the order of Erectolobiformes, there are 43 species in the entire order. The whale shark is the only pelagic species, so it's the only one that lives in open ocean. All of the other species of that order are benthic or semi-benthic, so they're bottom dwelling. The most common and closest relative perhaps would be the carpet shark, and they live on the bottom. They're stealth hunters. As I say, the only one of those 43 species that lives in the open oceans is the whale shark, so it's totally unique within its order. This is what an encounter with a whale shark looks like. I had my first encounter in 1989 up in Darwin, just the same. I was looking out as a school of fish when all of a sudden looming, coming in from the blue was this shadow. And I couldn't believe the size of it. It's just the size of a school bus coming at you. And it's amazing how an animal of this size can just appear out of nowhere. They're very, very gentle giants. No sharks are truly dangerous to human beings, but there's never been a single recorded aggression or attack of whale sharks on humans. So this is something to enjoy, this massive whale shark coming through. You can see here with the divers swimming alongside it, this whale shark measures somewhere between 40 and 50 feet. In the Galapagos, most of the animals that we see are these huge adults. And as Sophia mentioned earlier, most of them are actually females. So this is what an encounter is like. And for me to have that encounter the first time, I then went back to Puerto Ayora and started asking questions to my colleagues, friends, the scientists, the marine scientists that were working in the Galapagos. And incredibly, they all came up with the same answer for whatever question. We just don't know. We don't know where they give birth. We don't know anything about their reproductive cycle, their natural history. Absolutely nothing was known about them. And this is why we call it the greatest mystery of the oceans. And that is why the study began all those years ago. So 1995, more or less, we started looking at whale sharks. We were just taking simple observations, but we quickly realized that we were going to have to do a much more in-depth study. Nothing was known about them on a global scale. It was known that they'd been fished sustainably around the globe for their skin, for their oil, in a manner that, as I say, is sustainable. So local coastal populations. But somewhere around about the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, there was an increased impact with bycatch and fisheries. And then almost certainly around at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, they began to become part of the targeted fisheries as well. So originally their conservation status was placed more or less as vulnerable, although we don't have a firm idea, a sure idea of how many whale sharks there are in the oceans. It's very, very difficult to quantify those populations. In 2016, because of the higher levels of impact with fisheries, with pollution, with vessel strikes, et cetera, they were downgraded then to endangered. And we don't know if that's true. They could be in a worse situation. They could be critically endangered. We just don't know. But I think Sophie's now going to talk about many of the threats that the whale sharks are facing in our oceans today.
So frequently we get a question of why go through all this effort to study this particular shark? And well, one of the answers to that question is, well, their future is definitely uncertain. As my dad mentioned, they have been downgraded from vulnerable to endangered. And this, unfortunately, is not because of natural impacts, but instead a plethora of human or anthropogenic threats. These being targeted fisheries catch, bycatch, vessel strikes, marine pollution, climate change. And I'm going to go through every single one of these. You see, what these have done is they have reduced the global population of whale sharks by over 50% in 75 years. That's only 3 generations. So the impact that we are having as humans on these sharks is actually huge. Unfortunately, targeted fisheries still exist. We do have quite a few laws and protection acts that protect these whale sharks globally. Since the 2000s, they're part of CITES, which did definitely stop quite a few of the world fisheries. Unfortunately, in Asia, we still have the trade of and the commercial use of their oil and their fins. So this still is something that we're seeing up to today. And then we don't have to go that far, travel all the way to Asia to see the impacts. Right here, we're seeing the impacts ourselves on the whale sharks that we're working on. You see, only a couple of years ago, we tagged 8 whale sharks. And of these 8 whale sharks, 3 of them started showing transmissions on land. And we were like, what is going on? Unless these whale sharks grew legs, we know it wasn't them. Instead, we saw that their last transmissions occurred in fishing ports, both off mainland Ecuador and in mainland Peru. Unfortunately, we will not know exactly what happened to these whale sharks. We were able to retrieve a couple of these tags and talk to the people in the fishermen ports. And the 2 stories that we got were, one was that the tag had gotten caught in the net and had been brought out by the fisherman. There was a huge hole in the net, so he never saw the shark. Another one was that they did set the net around the shark, but managed to let it go. So hopefully these are true, but still it highlights the amount of how frequent these encounters between fishermen and whale sharks truly are. And then even though those stories seem positive, only this year we received a whole other story. Yes, they're falling prey as bycatch, but sometimes that bycatch is then being used by the fishermen. You see here on the 27th of March of this very year, the fishermen caught this whale shark not on purpose, but still took it out to land. And luckily, the people of the town rushed to the fishermen and said, stop, this is illegal, this is a protected animal, we need to put it back. The fishermen ran from the scene, but you see these amazing people, we definitely have to thank them for all the effort that they put in to bringing this whale shark back into the ocean. Unfortunately, the whale shark had been out and stranded for too long, and it did not make it. Only 2 days later, we received these images from another fisherman's port in Ecuador of a whale shark hanging off the side of a boat. And yes, this must have been another whale shark caught by bycatch. Maybe it wasn't intended, not targeted, but still, the moment that they hang the whale shark from the net like this, they're already damaging its organs. So by releasing it, they're not truly, the chances of this whale shark surviving are very, very slim. And then we have this, what happens. This occurred today. We received this video this very morning, and I thought I must include it in the presentation. Here we see this whale shark with the rubs of like the nets, the ropes. You can see it, and you can still see that there is some sort of rope attached to its tail. So unfortunately, this must have been another whale shark that was caught, maybe as bycatch. But then you see that there's something on the side, and even though they could have or might have tried to release it alive, they did not. They actually then extracted the liver for its oil, as you can see here. So they knew exactly what they were doing. So unfortunately, there was no intent of releasing the shark alive. So this is happening today. Seeing that this was such a big impact, we decided to take the data that we have been collecting for the last 10 years with the Galapagos Whale Shark Project and all our partners, and we decided to overlay the whale shark tracks over the fishing effort. And as you can see in this video, as years go by, the dots are the whale sharks and then the red spots are the fishing effort. You can see how the whale shark tracks start to interact more closely with the fishing efforts. We see how the overlap is actually increasing year after year. Unfortunately, we definitely see that fishing is increasing, and we saw that the highest fishing effort and highest overlap occurred between 2019-2020, the last years of this data set. And we saw, unfortunately, that 48.8 of the last transmissions that our whale sharks gave actually occurred in areas of very high fishing pressure. So what is happening to these whale sharks? That is what we're trying to find out. Unfortunately, we have another problem. You see, we have this ever-growing marine traffic in the oceans. You can see it right here, the vessel traffic density in the second image on the right. You see just how strong the marine traffic density is. It's ever-growing. And because whale sharks are deep divers, but spend over 50% of their lifetime in very shallow waters from 0 to 15 meters, they are overlapping quite frequently with the shipping route, both vertically and horizontally. They have a high rate of encounter with vessels, and thus vessel strikes, propeller strikes are huge. Here in this image, you can see how this whale shark is missing part of its head. Luckily, whale sharks do have a very small brain, so this one managed to survive. But how many are we never going to see that were impacted by a propeller and that sunk to the bottom, so we'll never truly see how big the impact is? Then we have the problem of marine pollution. We mentioned that the whale shark is a filter feeding species, and to be able to take in all the food, all the zooplankton that it wants to feed on, the coral eggs, fish eggs, it has to take huge amounts of water in through its mouth and pass it through its gills, sorry. And as it does so, it cannot filter what it's catching. So the problem of microplastics is actually huge on whale sharks. There is a recorded story of a whale shark swallowing a single straw that then hardened in its gut, punctured its gut, and led to its death. So a single straw can have that impact. And then we see this other video of a whale shark that we saw here in the Galapagos only 2 years ago, swimming through Darwin Island with this massive net completely surrounding its pectoral fin. And as you can see in the video, that is actually cutting into the pectoral fin of the whale shark, and it is starting to literally cut completely. Like, that whale shark would have most likely lost its pectoral fin if the diver in question did not pull off the net and did not cut it. Luckily, he had a knife with him and was able to release this net from the whale shark. We constantly see sharks coming by Darwin Island, missing part limbs like fins, their tail, and we know that a lot of these are from ghost nets, which are another problem with marine pollution. Unfortunately, the diver was not able to pick up that net, take it up to the surface, because it weighed about 50 kilos with all the barnacles that were encrusted on it. But there you see a happy whale shark, probably extremely relieved, swimming away into the blue. Then we have other threats that we might even be contributing to, and that is the use of squalene oil. You see, squalene oil is used in medicines like those used for joint pain. So if you are an athlete or an elderly person that has joint pain and do buy these medicines, always make sure it doesn't say squalene, elasmobranch, or even shark. Some people are proud to promote that it has shark products in it. please do not support this because you're supporting the shark fin industry. Then the fins are still being used around the world for trophies and for soup. And not to go very far, this is what we saw in the Galapagos in 2017. An illegal boat came in through the Marine Reserve. It was stopped, luckily, but when they looked inside, it had over 7,200 species, individual sharks, and amongst it was a juvenile whale shark. You're on mute.
Coming back to the study itself and the Galapagos, we often get the question then, why investigating the Galapagos? Well, the Galapagos certainly is unique, but we wanted to find out more information. If you don't have baseline information, if you don't have a full understanding of the behavior, the natural life cycle, and the natural history of an animal, you cannot protect it. You cannot create the management policies and the legislation that come from that to actually say, these are the areas we need to protect, and this is why we need to protect a specific area. So first and foremost, we had to come up with the study itself. So next slide. Most of these are fairly simple. We needed to determine sex. We wanted to look at DNA. Photo identification is a very, very powerful tool that we're using. We realized that we needed to use all of the available technology at the time. And perhaps the most surprising and fascinating element that we introduced in 2017 was blood chemistry and ultrasound, which we were able to carry out for the first time successfully in 2018. Then we also want to look at deep diving, because the tags that we're generally using, if you like, the tags that are available today in the market have a crush depth of about 2,000 meters. That's only 2 kilometers. And the ocean floor around Galapagos goes down to about 10,000 feet. We know that the whale sharks go way beyond the crush depth of those satellite tags. So we need to have tags and technology that can actually follow them all the way to their deepest dives and so on. We also wanted to look aside of that at behavior and associated species. To understand an individual species, you have to look at the species that they're interacting with. Ambiental conditions and how are these changing over a period of time. For example, we've been studying now for, this will be our 12th year, so ambiental conditions and seasonal variation. And as Jen mentioned earlier on, effects of climatic variations we're seeing increasingly now. Everybody, I think, is aware of this incoming El Nino event, the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And this could be a historic event. It could be the largest El Nino on record. We just don't know. How's that going to affect individual species? But more importantly, how is it going to affect the oceans all around the globe? And how is that going to affect the human race as well? All of these have, it's all connected. There's connectivity between in the entire planet. So you can't study a single area or a single species. You have to study what's happening all around the globe. Then, of course, other aggregations in the Galapagos Marine Reserve, which we've identified, but we haven't been able to study. So just coming back to our encounters with whale sharks, what is known and what is not known? Well, we know that they're filter feeders. We know that they're gentle giants. We know they give live birth, but we don't know where they're mating. We don't know where they're giving birth. The young are born probably at the size somewhere between around about 2 to 3 feet, which is 60, 70, 80 centimeters. But we actually have no idea where they're being born and where the nurseries are. By the time most recreational divers see them, they tend to be between about 3 to 5 meters in length. We don't see the tiny, tiny little neonates. Why is that? We believe that they may be remaining possibly in a semi-benthic manner, so they're living closer to the ocean floor in deeper waters where simply recreational divers are not going. But we need to identify those nursery areas, those areas which are crucial for the formative years of the neonates, if we're able to protect the future of that species. So there's an enormous amount which is simply not known. So it's imperative that we gather as much data as possible in order to fully understand the species. In Galapagos, if we see the next slide here, you can see this is our investigation site. This is where we're doing most of our work. Darwin Island is not somewhere that most people go because it's off the edge of the archipelago way north, and it's only lucky divers that get to go there. It is quite unique. It's a volcanic platform that rises out of the abyssal depths from greater than 3,500 or 10,000 feet deep. Why is it that all of the whale sharks, because over 90% of all sightings take place up in Darwin Island, why is it that so many whale sharks are going there? Is there a specific reason? Is it a waypoint? So in other words, are they traveling through Darwin on their way to somewhere? And if they are traveling through, where and what is that somewhere? Is the Galapagos Marine Reserve and the platform, which is over 100,000 square kilometers wide, the actual Galapagos geological platform itself, is it playing some key role in the reproductive cycle of the whale shark? Are they birthing in Galapagos, and are the young living in these areas, perhaps out of sight, in plain sight? So very close to where we're diving, but simply out of the depths and out of sight. One of the very first things that we discovered, which was quite phenomenal, was the numbers of males to females. In Galapagos, as Sophia mentioned earlier on, we assumed that the large whale sharks were males. Actually, we discovered that these large sharks are all female, or 99.8% is the ratio that we're looking at right now. Of all of our sightings in Galapagos are females. Now, you look at any population of any animal on the planet and ask yourself that question: how often will you go somewhere and see almost 100% concentrations of females, and why? It usually has something specific to do with reproduction. They're not mating because the males aren't there, so they must be giving birth. So it's very easy to say, yes, they must be coming to Galapagos to give birth, but how do you prove that? It's very complicated. But there must be something very, very unusual going on in Galapagos for almost 100% of our sightings to be females. One of the second facts that we discovered of whale sharks, and this is perhaps common in many migratory species, birds travel tens of thousands of miles, probably using magnetic orientation behavior. Turtles return 15, 20 years later when they're sexually mature to the beach, the very same beach where they hatched from 15 or 20 years before, to breed and lay their eggs themselves. They're all using probably magnetic orientation behavior as well as other environmental factors. What is that? Well, they're using the magnetic signature, which is given off by the seafloor below. And they could also be using the magnetic polarity of the planet. And they use that as a virtual map. And you can see very clearly here how a female whale shark that we had tagged is transmitting. Each one of those little dots is a transmission on the surface. So the seafloor below her is almost 10,000 feet, 3,500 meters below, but she can sense the magnetism. So she's traveling along this deep-seated fissure or fracture, and fissures and fractures give off a different signature or a different signal to the surrounding seafloor. So they can detect a difference in the magnetic anomalies that surround these fissures. So she gets to the end of that fracture, and then she turns a hard right, obviously knowing fully well that she had to travel south along this fracture. And you can see where she then wandered a little bit off the main fracture itself, realized that that was not the path of travel, reoriented, and came back to the main fracture and fissure. So very clearly, they're using magnetic orientation. One of the powerful tools that we have are divers and underwater digital cameras. It's much easier these days to snap a few photographs of whale sharks, and we use certain key observations of the whale sharks to recognize them, to identify them. It can be distinguishing marks, for example, the top of a dorsal fin that's been cut off by a propeller or by a predator. You can see the one in the center bottom, which has very clearly what was probably a rope from a fishing net or something that fortunately it was liberated from, and you can see the one which is on the top right, which has a huge chunk taken out of the belly, and that's almost certainly a natural predator. It could be a large shark, or it could be an orca that might have taken a large bite out of it. And as you can see in the photograph, that injury is well healed. So they do heal, as Sophie said, for some very, very significant injuries, and that could have been when it was much younger and the scar tissue has grown with the animal. So we can use those, but we can also use the constellation of spots that each whale shark has, because this is just like a fingerprint, if you like. And here you can see the diver getting into position to take a photograph. We're using both left and right flanks, and the place exactly that we're interested in, if you can see the next photo, is between the fifth gill slit and the dorsal fin. So that is the key area. So if you're a recreational diver and you're watching this right now and you have photographs of whale sharks, we would ask you, please upload them to Wild Book for Whale Sharks. It's a global data platform, And you can get to, if it hasn't been named before, you can name your shark. And if it's resighted somewhere else or in the same area, you'll actually get an email. So it really is fun to participate in this. And this helps science groups around the world identify movements over a large area. So you might get animals returning to Galapagos. We now have data that shows us over 600 individuals that we know about. Our small project itself has identified 600 individuals just in the Galapagos, which makes it one of the largest and most unique aggregations on the planet. So by using simple techniques like photo identification, we can discover a huge amount of data. In this case here, this was a recent success story, very, very exciting. A recreational diver in Revillagigedo, excuse my pronunciation there, in Mexico, one of the offshore islands there, 14th of May, 2021. Took a photograph. So somebody who was just diving for fun took a photograph of a whale shark, uploaded it to Wildbook. A year and a month later, sorry, just under a year later, 4th of April 2022, another recreational diver, not a scientist, took a photograph of a whale shark, uploaded it to Wildbook, and bingo, we got a match. So that piece of information showed connectivity between the Galapagos and coastal Mexico, and that's a huge discovery. So simple science like that, citizen science, can play a huge role in discovering more about these mysterious creatures and their movements, their migrations around the planet. And that information is literally worth gold. So in Galapagos, again, average size, about 12 to 14 meters. If you dive elsewhere in the world, and I'm sure a lot of you watching this evening with us have been out diving perhaps in the Philippines, in the Maldives with them, and what you might have seen are juveniles and juvenile males. Most of the whale sharks that snorkelers and divers get to see generally are between about 4 and 8 meters, as I mentioned earlier on. In Galapagos, average size 12 to 14, and we do spot the big ones up to about 16 meters, and they're recorded to reach lengths of about 18 meters. So Galapagos is certainly a unique population. The question that we're trying to answer, the key question that everybody would like to know, is whether or not they're coming to Galapagos to give birth, and are they pregnant? Are they pregnant and giving birth in Galapagos? Are they coming to Galapagos and mating? If so, where are the males? Are they down deep? Are they part of the southern aggregation? We just don't know. But if we can discover key facts like where they're mating, if they're pregnant, where they're giving birth, then we can obviously advance with management policies and with legislation, and we can protect them in these very, very key areas. But how do you discover whether a whale shark is pregnant or not? Unfortunately, there's the usual technique, the one that was first used in 2005, and that is a dead whale shark that is brought in, part of a bycatch in Taiwan. Unusually, though, the fishermen did invite scientists to come in and carry out an autopsy. They were able to examine that female whale shark, and the incredible data they came out with, as you can see, 304 fetuses in a single female whale shark, which makes them the most prolific shark on the planet. Now, we have absolutely no idea if all 300 fetuses actually then are born. There might be internal cannibalism, for example, which occurs in other shark species. So the neonates, literally like a Pac-Man sort of thing, are moving up and down the ovaries, eating each other, and that gives them a stronger, that makes them stronger. They might be the ones that survive. That could be the case in whale sharks. They might pop out, if you'll excuse the phrase, 100 baby whale sharks at a time. They might give birth to 300. They might give birth to one over a period of 300 days. We just don't know. So all of these fascinating facts we need to discover if we're going to be able to protect them in the future. And incredibly too, all of those 300 neonates, or fetuses rather, were actually sired by a single mating from a single male. Obviously, there aren't huge encounters between whale sharks, so they need to maximize each one of those encounters. One of the key pieces of technology that we started using in 2011 was satellite tags. Before that, they'd been very, very expensive. Almost impossible for us to access. And of course, the size came down. So technology improved. And we started off with some fairly simple spot tags, which only gave us horizontal movements. So we could only see movements on the surface. Little by little, over a period of a decade, we've moved away from the spot tags to splash tags. We've tried pat tags, which are pop-up archival tags, and different techniques also with tagging. So we started off with a subcutaneous implantation of a dart and we towed the tags. Unfortunately, they appeared a little bit too interesting for associated species. So they were being ripped out by other sharks, probably Galapagos sharks and silky sharks, that thought they were something edible. And of course, they would rip them off and then spit them out, and we would just have a floating tag. But unfortunately, we would lose an awful lot of hardware when that happened. So we're changing our techniques. And people say, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? We're developing all of these field techniques as we go along, because you have to remember, this work has never actually been done before, and nobody else on the planet are actually working with population similar to the one we're working with in Galapagos. Quite exciting. The Blue Planet BBC team approached us and said, could you try a fin camera? So we did. We put a fin camera on the whale shark, and that actually led to some interesting footage which showed interaction between different species. And we know there's a lot of interaction between these different species, but it's never been seen before because nobody's ever captured it. And in this video, you can see here silky sharks that are actually rubbing up against the whale shark. And it would seem, we believe, that they're using the whale shark for exfoliation. So they're probably ridding themselves of ectoparasites. That's what we're assuming here. It might feel good as well for the sharks to do that. It probably doesn't have any benefits to the whale shark. The whale shark seems to shudder or move slightly. You can see that the camera somewhat shudders every time a silky shark rubs up against it. I don't think it's harmful in any way, but it must be an interesting interaction between the two of them. So whether it's symbiosis, mutualism, or whatever, we don't know, but certainly beneficial for the silky sharks if they can rid themselves of ectoparasites. And this is the very first time that this was actually captured on camera and was used by the BBC Blue Planet team in the Blue Planet 2 series. So you can actually see that. So interesting facts that we're discovering with the new techniques that we're developing literally year by year. Now, blood draw had been used many, many times before in aquariums or in captive environments. So when whale sharks or mantas or other sharks have been captured in fishing nets, scientists have been able to draw blood, but it had never been tried in a free swimming environment. And as you saw by the videos that we looked at earlier on, whale sharks in Galapagos are literally just swimming by. We don't have the luxury of stopping them, in a captive manner and keeping them there interested or circling around us for a period of time. So the maximum amount of time that we have with a whale shark is usually somewhere between a minute and 2. So 90 seconds is about the average. So you can see here the typical blood draw kit. This was the one that was being used by scientists in aquariums. It has a very, very large needle. That's a 16 gauge needle. And the whale shark has the thickest skin of any animal in the animal kingdom. The hides are not quite as tough as rhinos and elephants, but it does need a very, very strong needle to actually pierce the skin and get in to find a blood vessel. And you can see that it has an extension tube fixed to it. That's to allow the diver to move around, because obviously as you're swimming as fast as possible to keep up alongside the whale shark, you can't have a needle and a syringe connected directly because it wouldn't stay there. You wouldn't be able to draw the blood with any ease. Also, the blood that goes into the extension tube, first of all, is contaminated with seawater. So first of all, you have to pull in a certain amount into a lateral syringe, then you close the stopcock and you pour pure blood into the principal syringe itself. No easy feat when the animal is swimming along at the speed of an Olympic swimmer. So we tried various different techniques. We knew that you can draw blood from the dorsal fin, from the base of the dorsal. We knew that you could draw it from the pelvic fin, as you can see the case of the divers in this particular image. But we found that the pectoral fin was probably the easiest one, if you can use the term easy, in this whole process, because the whale sharks, although they might be unaware of what you're doing, they're just continuing on their way. They're not stopping for you to take blood and to process them, to tag them, and do all the photo ID and so on. And in the following video, you can see how a diver approaches the whale shark. We have sharks that we like to call donors because they appear to be swimming a little more slowly. They're very relaxed. They're often swimming in a horizontal manner. They're not swimming down. So the fear is, of course, that they might, as the diver is trying to take blood, they might swim down and go beyond the depths that we can dive, which is about 120 feet or 40 meters, depending if we're on air or nitrox. So a very technical manner. You look for a white spot, which is approximately 90 degrees to the body and 90 degrees to the leading edge of the pectoral, somewhere in the middle of that of the fin. You pop in the needle if you can without bending it. As you see, there's no reaction whatsoever in the whale shark. She has no idea we're trying that. It doesn't work there, so you find another white spot. And you keep pressure, you keep suction on the lateral syringe. So as soon as it hits a blood vessel, you'll see right now, blood squirts into the tube. You can see the blood coming into the tube. So all you need to do there, fortunately, it seems like a good blood flow. You might have to wiggle it around a little bit. The shark very conveniently is swimming up. Again, that's the fear that they go down whilst you're still trying to draw blood. And once you fill the lateral syringe, you close the stopcock and you fill the main syringe itself. When you have about 10 cc's of blood, you've got more than enough to carry out all the procedures that we need. She was very, very obliging, this whale shark. She was actually swimming up towards the surface. We managed to draw blood, and then she turned around and actually swam by us a second time. So very, very curious often about what we're doing. You can see the syringe is filling there very nicely. As soon as you finish, out comes the needle. She has no idea whatsoever. There's no reaction from the whale shark, and off you go. So this particular whale shark, we had tagged on an earlier dive. You can see the tag on the dorsal fin. We check the number of the tag to make sure that we've got her fully ID'd. So we have a tag which will give us her whereabouts, and we have her photo ID, which gives her her official ID. Although we've got an anticoagulant in the syringe, we go straight back on board and we centrifuge the blood as fast as possible, separating out the plasma and the full blood, and immediately we can then freeze some of that blood for posterior analysis in labs. But you can see an ISTAT there, which is very common in A&E in hospitals and labs around the world. That's for immediate analysis of certain aspects of the blood chemistry. And one of the key things, the factors that we can look at right there, is the level of lactic acid. So lactic acid is an indicator of basic health and of possible stress. And I'm happy to say that until now, we've never actually found an animal that we think is sickly or stressed. And that, I think, is very important to point out, that we're not stressing these animals, we're not harming them in any way in all of these procedures that we're carrying out. And here we have an amazing component of the work that we're doing. We're lucky enough to work with some of the greatest experts on the planet with ultrasound and blood from Okinawa Chaurumi Aquarium and Research Center. And this is Dr. Rui Matsumoto, who is doing an ultrasound underwater. Ultrasound, of course, is difficult. This is the only unit, professional unit that can be used underwater. He has to warm it up for about 30 seconds. It takes a 30-second delay. So we spot a whale shark, he swims out as fast as possible, and then we have really no idea of the physiology of a whale shark. We have clear idea of the physiology of other sharks. So he's sort of going along and developing the technique as we progress in the field. And very exciting news, 2018, we were the first team ever to get successful imaging of the interior, the insides of reproductive organs of a whale shark. And this is the ovaries, of which they have two. And here, according to the experts, we were not very sure, but the experts pointed out and made it clearer. They outlined the egg follicles that are in the ovaries. So we knew that this female was probably at a point where she was fertile, ready for mating, for breeding. We still have not managed to actually find one with neonates with fetuses inside it, but that is the aim, and we hope that with all the help that we're getting with GCT and all of you listening, watching this evening, that we'll be able to get back out in the field in 2024 and continue this very important work with the ultrasound, because that might give us the finite answer to the question whether or not they're pregnant. And that, for underwater scientists, is like the El Dorado of the archaeological world. It would be absolutely brilliant to discover. Here you can see how we place the satellite tags on the dorsal fin. It's a completely non-invasive technique. You can see that Sophie swimming along there simply opens it. It's like a closed peg. It works by pressure. We have some nylon pads on there. So it simply attaches. The whale shark has no idea, once again, that she's been tagged. She's actually very curious again. She also did a double swim past. So once they're tagged like that, off they go. And that tag will give us not only surface data, but also data of what they're doing and how they're diving. In the meantime, you've got another person coming in to take blood from one of the fins, and a third diver, which is doing photo ID. So here's Jenny going onto the side, the left side, having already got the right side. So that shark is literally scienced in a very, very short period of time. And that's how the tag sits on the fin. So very, very non-invasive techniques, but they produce huge amounts of data. And I think you can see on this next slide, the first tracks that we've got, or the tracks that we've got over a period of a decade, and you can see very clearly how they're moving around the eastern tropical Pacific, but even more key than that, the connectivity that we have with specific areas. We already mentioned Mexico. We discovered connectivity with Costa Rica, with Cocos Island, strong connectivity, of course, with the coastal areas of Ecuador, but also a very, very strong connectivity with coastal areas of Peru. And that is the kind of information that we can use to go to governments, to go to organizations and say, this is why we need to protect these animals. And this is the area that we need to protect. Sophie.
So now that you all see all these amazing efforts that we go through to be able to study this animal, I once again like to ask, like, why go through all these efforts? Why do all of this, go to very remote locations, expensive expeditions to gather this data? Besides their intrinsic right to live, they're also a highly important species for ocean health. You see, the whale shark is important ecologically for nutrient transport. As it moves huge distances, it takes nutrients from the feeding areas to the areas in the open ocean that have very little nutrients, defecates and brings nutrients, and in this manner creates life. Also, blue carbon. Blue carbon is something that's being talked about so often now, and whale sharks are part of it. Whale sharks naturally mitigate the effects of climate change by sequestering the carbon. You see, they're massive, their bodies are made up of so much carbon. So when they die, they actually sequester this carbon to the bottom of the ocean and take it out of the atmosphere for centuries, and also become food for bottom-dwelling species. Then they also regulate the levels of zooplankton and phytoplankton in the ocean, which is really important. Every time you take a deep gulp of delicious air, remember that you owe it to the whale sharks. Then they're also important economically. You see, tourism flourishes in sites where we see these whale sharks. And in that manner, tourism actually brings economic help to these coastal communities next to the sighting locations. A whale shark is definitely worth more alive than it is dead. You see, in a single lifetime, it can produce around $2 million if it lives around 60 years. And we know that they probably live a lot longer than that. Meanwhile, a single whale shark in the black trade goes for about $20,000, so definitely worth more alive than dead. And then my personal favorite use for whale sharks is how they serve as ocean ambassadors. You see, because they are highly charismatic, they're so impressive, so beautiful, and people want to see this animal, want to protect this animal. It's easier to protect a whale shark than it might be to protect like a worm, a marine worm. So we use this factor to be able to protect ocean areas that not only protect the whale shark, but also protect commercially interested species and other endangered species such as sharks, rays, tuna, coral reefs, and different ocean habitats. To finish off, I'd like to tell you the story of 3 whale sharks that we have met, named, tagged, and tracked. First, we in 2019. We followed her track all the way into 2020. She was giving a beautiful track, circling around, going what seemed to be like a full migratory track back into Darwin until we lost her transmission. When we checked her transmission, we saw that she was in an area of very intense fishing pressure. Her tag was swimming at a speed faster than 5 knots, and also the tag was giving a perfectly clear signal. We will never know exactly what happened to Hope, but we believe she might have fallen prey as bycatch or even as a target species. Because we had been sharing the story of Hope on our media, people knew about this whale shark and had been following her story. So when she stopped transmitting, people were as heartbroken as we were. Usually when you read in the news, another set of sharks has been caught, another whale has been stranded, doesn't have that same impact. But because this was a whale shark with a name, people felt very moved with this story, and they shared stories, they wrote songs for her, they made drawings for her, and it caught the attention. And even though it was horrible, it also shared the message of what is happening not only to a single whale shark, but to millions of sharks, rays, marine mammals in the ocean every single day. Luckily, a year later, we tagged a couple more whale sharks, amongst them a whale shark, funky little pectoral fin. Nemo did what we thought Hope was going to do. She left Darwin, and after an amazing 80-day journey, she returned to Darwin Island, showing just how important these waters are for this species. And then Coco, tagged the same year as Nemo, did a showed us another amazing track. She moved from Darwin Island in Ecuador all the way up this migratory corridor to Cocos Island in Costa Rica, highlighting once again that this marine corridor between these two islands is very important for migratory species. You see other organizations like Migramar, the Galapagos Science Center with the San Francisco University of Quito, the Galapagos Whale Shark Project, Charles Darwin Foundation, were collecting data that were showing that this marine corridor was actually very important for many migratory species. And with this, we managed this huge success story of the creation of a new marine reserve, the Brotherhood Sisterhood Marine Reserve. This is part of the 30-30 goal, and as Jen mentioned, it's only the beginning of what we want and need to protect, but this goes to show that the data that we're collecting is so important. It's not just because of curiosity, which in its rights is important in itself, but also it serves for direct conservation actions. And then just to leave you with a lot of hope, I want to tell you about this new study that we're starting here in the Galapagos Islands. You see, in the last 10 years, we've heard from fishermen, park rangers, tourists, that they are sighting whale sharks in the opposite season, the warm season, and in the central and southern islands that we had never studied whale sharks before. They've mentioned that they've sighted them in this area. But how do you find whale sharks that you don't know where they are? Well, with advanced and novel methods like the use of an ultralight. We're using this ultralight that is helping us find whale sharks from the sky. And then our friend from the ultralight radios down to us. We're waiting down on a fisherman's boat in the sea level, radios down to us when he finds a shark, lets us know where the shark is. We jump in, no scuba gear since we don't know where we're going to see the shark. And on one single breath of air, we have to tag this whale shark, photo ID, and hopefully also check for the sex of the whale shark. The goals of this new study is to find out where whale sharks are when we aren't tracking them. So the opposite season as to the Darwin study that we've been carrying out for the last 10 years. So where they are between February and June during the warm season. Also find out the connection between this northern aggregation, this northern constellation that we have in the Galapagos and the southern constellation. See if they're the same or different populations, and also look at differences in behavior. Maybe, as my dad mentioned, we might even find males in the south. So this is something we're starting to look at. There you see the whale shark happily swimming away with its tag, giving us crucial, very important information. So there's still so much more work to do, and I am hopeful that we will discover the secrets of the ocean giants. You're on mute.
Sorry. Okay, so as you see, technology is not my forte. I think you've given a lot of information. I hope not too much, and I hope it's been interesting for you. The question of the future of the oceans is the one that we're always being asked. Is there hope? Is there a future? Yes, of course there is. It's not too late, but we must focus our efforts together. We've got to continue fighting to protect more areas. The 30 and 30 is just part of that story, and we cannot do it without baseline data. We cannot do it without scientific data. Without that, you can't go to governments and say, we need to protect these areas for this reason. So that data is absolutely key, and we cannot do it without your support. Future of the oceans, it's in all our hands. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Sophia and Jonathan. That was shocking, inspiring, and very moving all at the same time. Like, I have personally learned so much, and yeah, thank you for sharing those stories with us. If anybody has any questions for the Greens, please submit them in our Q&A box. We may not have time to get to a huge question panel today, but as I said, we're going to work together on a follow-up email to look at your questions and answer them as best we can. So now I have the pleasure of handing over to our very own Jess Howard, who is also a marine biologist. Jess has got a lot of experience working on different ocean projects in Galapagos, specifically on plastics and initially the interaction of plastics and invasive species in the ocean environment. So Jess has been with the GCT team since 2021 and is the project manager and coordinates the communications for our regional plastics research and solutions network, Pacific Plastics Science to Solutions. So over to you, Jess.
Amazing. Thanks so much for the intro, Jen. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our growing network of plastic pollution researchers in Galapagos and the wider Eastern Tropical Pacific as well. And I'm going to talk you through some of our preliminary results as well. So to start off with, I'm just going to zoom out of Galapagos for a second. So we know that the Eastern Tropical Pacific area is an area of such great ecological conservation and economic importance. As we've heard, it's exceptionally biodiverse and is really, really important for endemic species and migratory species such as the whale shark that we've just heard all about. We also know that unfortunately it is under huge amounts of threat from the increasing tide of plastic pollution. So we're producing more plastic now than we ever have before. And a recent study showed that over 170 trillion plastic particles are currently floating around the global ocean, which is just mind-blowing. We have found plastic pollution every single environment we've looked for it in, from the top of mountains all the way to the deepest depths of our oceans. So we know that plastic poses a huge risk in and of itself, but we also know that it exacerbates these other threats that Jen was mentioning earlier. So this is a huge problem in the Eastern Tropical Pacific region as a really biodiverse area, and then especially in remote islands such as Galapagos. So we talk about how biodiverse and incredible Galapagos is quite a lot, and I just really like this image as a really visual demonstration of that. So this is an aerial photograph from one of our partners, the Iguanas from Above project. And this is kind of a typical Galapagos scene. You can see sea turtles, sea lions, heaps of marine iguanas, and then these lava rocks covered in tiny little red spots that are the Sally Lightfoot crabs. So this is what we kind of think of as like an iconic Galapagos environment. So unfortunately, increasingly, this is the case for a lot of the beaches in Galapagos as well. A lot of them now are looking like this. So this is a fairly remote location, which means that Galapagos National Park rangers don't get out there that much to be able to clean it. It's quite hard to get to. So you can really see this buildup of plastic and other debris coming up onto the beach. Even on beaches that are visited really regularly. So this is Tortuga Bay. Anyone who's been to Galapagos has probably been there. It's like this gorgeous white sandy beach, and it often gives the appearance to people of being incredibly pristine because you can't see a lot of the plastic that's there. That's for a couple of reasons. It's because it gets cleaned so frequently that a lot of the macroplastic is being removed. So actually you find more microplastic there. You just can't see it as much. It's really hard to spot with your eyes if you're not looking for it. However, one of our colleagues, Anne, on one of her morning walks to Tortuga Bay, found this aggregation of plastic bottles. They weren't laid out like this, but she picked them up from all over the beach. And this is about 50 plastic bottles that had washed in seemingly overnight. Now, interestingly, you can see that a lot of them look quite clean. They're not that degraded. So we think that these might be entering the ocean at a fairly local source, but I'll get into that in a little bit. So this is a Galapagos National Park and Conservation International trip that I was lucky enough to join a few years ago. This is a small stretch of coastline on the eastern side of Isabella Island, which is the biggest island. And this was an 8-day trip. And during that trip, we were just tasked with cleaning this small section of coastline. And at the end of 8 days, we had 8 tons of plastic and other types of pollution that we had removed from just that small stretch of coastline. So these bags, you can see, represent just a very small sample of what we were finding there. So these remote locations that are cleaned a maximum of once a year really illustrate this problem of how much plastic pollution is accumulating in the archipelago. So with this growing concern from the local community, the Galapagos National Park, and lots of our partners on the islands, there are like coming to us and saying, what are we going to do about this plastic problem? We don't know where it's coming from. We need to investigate the impacts it's having, and we need to find solutions. So for the last few years, we've been trying to do just that with all of our partners on the islands. So we started off as a fairly local team in Galapagos, investigating the impacts, looking at where we think it's coming from, and piloting some solutions. And then quite quickly, we realized that it's not a local issue. We know that pollution is washing in from the currents that Jonathan and Sophia mentioned earlier from the east of the islands. So we know that a lot of plastic can travel from the mainland and other areas. So this is a regional problem and it needs regional solutions to fix it. So we then developed our network into a regional network, which is the Pacific Plastic Sciences Solutions Network. We're an international group, but we work solely focused in this region. So our project is looking at the sources of plastic pollution. So where is it coming from, and trying to quantify those sources. We're then looking at the impacts of plastic pollution, both on local communities and wildlife. And then we're also trying to pilot solutions at every stage that we know plastic is entering the environment and impacting species as well. So these smiling happy faces represent our growing network of communities, businesses, universities, NGOs, and government organizations that we are working with on this really important issue. This is actually only a small subset of the team now. We've grown a lot over the last few busy years. So now on to some of the juicy bits, some of the preliminary results on our sources. So we've been running coastal surveys with the help of our partners on the islands to track how much plastic is accumulating and where we think that's accumulating. So from this data, we can see that actually the plastic is accumulating quite often on the eastern coast, the eastern facing coastlines of Galapagos. So that fits in with that theory that those currents are bringing in plastic pollution from elsewhere. You can see this really well illustrated in the map on the top right of the screen. So that's San Cristobal Island. You can see that on the left-hand side, that's facing west. There's very few plastic accumulation spots. And then compared to the eastern side of the island, you can see that the data points are much larger and are darker in color, representing more and more plastic pollution building up on that side. So this actually ground truths some of the oceanographic models that we've been working on as well that show that accumulation on the eastern side of the islands. But as well as the mainland being a source, we think it typically takes around 3 months for plastic pollution from the mainland to make its way all the way to Galapagos. We also think that there is a much more local source. So this map on the left, you can see Galapagos there somewhere in the middle towards the left. And then all of these red spots are fishing activity. And the blue spots are simulated plastic particles. So this is from a model that we've developed. So you can see that the area of fishing activity where the plastic is being released from, you can see it then building up on these eastern facing shorelines of the Galapagos Archipelago. And this correlates, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, with this area of really high intensity industrial fishing that's kind of sandwiched in an area of high seas between the economic exclusion zone of Ecuador, both outside Galapagos and off the mainland as well. So what are we actually finding when we're picking up bits of plastic? So over half of the plastic we find in Galapagos is these kind of small hard plastic fragments that you can see on the right there. We think this is because Galapagos is a pretty harsh environment. You've got really intense UV from the equatorial sun right above you. You've got salty seas and lots of wave action on these coastlines. So plastic breaks down pretty quickly there. So these plastics that you can see on the right are well on their way to becoming microplastic. We won't go into any detail about microplastic too much in this presentation, but we know that as they break down into microplastics, they pose a huge threat to species, marine, terrestrial, everyone. So 69% of the items that we find that are completely intact are single-use items. We actually think this might be a little bit higher because a lot of the microplastic that we find that's broken down into those hard fragments, we can't actually tell what that's come from. So a lot of those could very well be attributed to single-use plastics as well. So this 69%, that's a staggering amount. And a lot of these plastics are completely avoidable, like the single-use plastic bottles you can see on the right there. So this is really sad to see, but also it lets us know really key clear points that we can intervene to try and prevent these single-use plastics being used and then being discarded into the marine environment and washing up in Galapagos. So some impacts for you. So we found across our research that 52 species have found to be either entangled in plastic or ingesting it, 20 of which are endemic to Galapagos. We've also found that 52% of Galapagos marine invertebrates that we've sampled have contained microplastics. So that kind of demonstrates the scale of how many species we're impacting with this plastic pollution. We also know this won't come as a surprise after Sophia and Jonathan's amazing talk, but we know that the highest scoring fish at risk from plastic pollution are the scalloped hammerhead and obviously the whale shark. So I'm just going to play this video on the right-hand side. When the video ends, it ends on a FAD, or a fish aggregating device, that has washed up onto a coastline in Galapagos. So fish aggregating devices are used to do exactly that. They kind of aggregate these fish beneath them, and then with the idea that they'll float through the marine reserve, out of the marine reserve into high seas, where those fish can then be fished and landed. So these FADs pose lots of different threats to marine species. They can entangle them in plastic or long lines while they're in the marine environment. They can also entangle species when they landed on the coastlines. And also, like I mentioned earlier, plastic breaks down really quickly in Galapagos. So these plastic components of the FAD can break down and then enter the food chain as microplastics as well. So we've identified FADs as quite a concerning product in itself. So some solutions. Firstly, I just wanted to say that we at GCT are trying to leverage the issue of plastics wherever we can to increase attention and raise awareness of other social justice issues, as well as other conservation and environmental issues as well. So we're trying to make that really clear across all of our solutions, that we're trying to get this kind of whole holistic approach using plastics as an entry point sometimes. So one of these are just going to be some examples of the solutions we're working on. I can't go into detail on everything right now, but just to give you an idea of what we're working on. So we're trying to stop pollution at source. So we know that plastic is coming from the mainland. We know that mainland Ecuador, Peru, countries like that leak a lot of their plastic into the environment through waste management or accidental littering, etc. So we're working with mainland malls in Ecuador and one in Chile now. And with them, we're introducing these returnable cup and crockery and cutlery schemes into the food courts. And I think in just 1 month, one of those projects had avoided 22,000 single-use plastic items in just 1 month. So it's a huge impact that projects like that are having. We also know that a lot of plastic is entering the ocean from fisheries. So we're working with partners in Peru and in Galapagos to work directly with fishers to both improve their waste management on board and also co-design solutions with them to help remove plastic from the environment once it's there. We're also working with the Galapagos National Park and Conservation International to improve the efficiency of their coastal cleanups. But then we also have this problem of what we need to do with that plastic once we've removed it from the marine environment. So we're working with community initiatives to design solutions like this is an example. This is Plastic Blocks, which uses beach plastic and kind of aggregates it with concrete to form these construction blocks. So we're repurposing that plastic so it's not entering the waste management system. We can just repurpose it into a different use. We're also working on some solutions in education. So this is a little sneak preview of our upcoming storybook called Alberto the Waved Albatross. So this is the story of Alberto. Again, he's a migratory species, and it's a story of him encountering plastic pollution in his day-to-day life and how that works out for him. So this book is aimed to raise awareness of the issues of plastic pollution and then also provide some solutions as well. Lastly, we have our policy work. So this is something that we're becoming increasingly involved with. And a few of us at GCT are lucky enough to be joining the global plastics treaty negotiations that are happening in Paris next week. So we will be there to represent our plastic research network and all of our partners to try and get those really upstream solutions to plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was a wonderful overview of our plastics program and some of the successes we've had to date. Just want to call your attention again to our Ocean Protection Appeal. If you've been inspired by the work that we've showcased in this webinar, please do what you can to help us continue it. We're really grateful for all of your support. Of course, your donations and anything you can do to raise awareness too. Sharing our messages on social media has a huge impact as well. We don't have a lot of time yet, so I'm just going to ask one question to each panel member, if that's okay, if we can hang on another few minutes. If you have questions that you would like us to answer by email, as I mentioned, please pop them in the box. So I am going to start with a question to you, Jonathan, if that's all right. We heard about the new Hermandad protected area. I wondered if you've seen any benefits of that 1 year later, and do you have any insight of how we can measure whether that's been effective or not as a new protected area?
I think that the effect of that is multiple. It's both tenuous and non-tenuous. I think it's a massive achievement in the eyes of the conservation community. It's a massive achievement that shows that it can be done, that we can protect bigger areas. And it also shows that nations can work together. What is quite unique about that particular marine protected area is that it took two governments of two nations, Costa Rica and Ecuador, to actually work together. And I think that's incredibly important, and it could pave the way for future marine protected areas. And if we could get other governments in coastal areas of South America, then of course we can have massive areas protected. So I think that's one massive change that we've made there, and it changes the mindset and how you can do things and what you can do. I think it's too early yet to say physically we're seeing differences. I would say probably 2 to 3 years down the line, we should see an increase in certain species, possibly some of the commercial species, and a decrease maybe in the secondary effects of industrial fishing. So maybe fewer animals with hooks in their mouths, trailing long lines, entangled in netting and so on and so forth. So we'll keep you posted about that. But that was something we saw when a certain area of Galapagos was removed from the general fisheries. We saw rapidly in just a period of 2 years, changes in certain aggregations of commercial fish. So you see the changes very quickly, and I'm sure that we will be seeing more in the future from that.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's that double edge of having the benefits for the biodiversity, but also the livelihoods, as you say, of benefiting the artisanal fisheries that are being responsible to. Thank you. Yep. So Sophie, a question for you that's come from Amelia. I love this one. It's great that communities have been so involved in the Whale Shark project. Are there any interventions or projects that specifically target community work, education, or engagement and training for local communities?
I love this question. Thank you so much. Definitely. First of all, the Galapagos Whale Shark Project likes to be a completely rounded project. So not only working with the species, but also working with the local community and different stakeholders. So as part of our project, for example, we've included work with the fishermen. We go out on a fisherman's boat now, and we're exchanging knowledge, and it's incredible how much they can teach us and how much we teach them. So it's beautiful to have started this conversation. But then also here in town, we're trying to work a lot with the school children. And our project has been a part of the new contextualized education program, making sure that the teachers are involving more contextualized like the ocean into their day-to-day teachings. And then every so often we collaborate with other partners like ECOS or EPI, who have a young club, a young children's club, where they are teaching them about ocean protection. Our project is always involved with them. With the shark ambassadors of the Charles Darwin Foundation, are always giving talks to them, playing games, you know. And then super exciting with the San Francisco University, the Galapagos Science Center and GCT, we have this new club called the Gills Club, which is helping bring young girls into science, into STEM, because we're still seeing a gender gap, we're still seeing gender inequality. So we're bringing these young girls into science projects and teaching them with monthly activities outdoors, how to become a part of the science world, how to be a part of ocean conservation. So definitely there's a lot of work being done, and there's a lot of work to still do. And it's being done by all the NGOs here in Galapagos and on mainland Ecuador as well.
Wonderful. That's so inspiring to hear about. And I think that also links with a reminder of this amazing data that's coming from the citizen science. So if anybody is lucky enough to have any observations of whale sharks, how important it is to do your bit for that global database and how much we've already learned from that. I think that's really awesome. All right, so final question for Jess. So that was a bit more of the grassroots angle. We work all the way up to the government level, and you mentioned about the Global Plastics Treaty in Paris. So I wondered if you could summarize what you hope to see from these negotiations.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so I think our main kind of goals going into it are to really well represent the work that's already being done in the region. Like, we've got this huge body of evidence about the sources of plastic pollution, the impacts that they're having. So we just want to make it really clear that we don't need to, you know, reinvent the wheel. We've already got so much amazing data there that should be completely available and should be pushed up to the political level. So we really want to well represent the research that we're already doing. Yeah, I think also we just need to make sure that everyone's well aligned in their messaging, because we know already from some insights we've had pre-plastics treaty negotiations that the plastics lobby and the oil and gas lobbies are all really super well aligned in their messaging and what they're all saying. So I think one of the key outcomes for us with the Paris negotiations is making those contacts with other NGOs, other research networks, both in the region and also globally, to make sure that we're all, you know, saying the same things, reinforcing the same messages, to ensure that by the end of 2024, when the outcome of the treaty happens, that we feel like we've had enough input and we're all happy with the results of that end treaty.
Thank you, Jess. Yeah, such important work, and to really make sure the voices of small communities that don't always get represented on these stages are there. And you know, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. I think we could, you know, we could easily do a few more hours with this amazing panel. Thank you again to everybody for joining. Please keep sending the questions and we will respond to as many as we can. I'd like to just leave you with those 3 C's from Sarah Darwin again, of recognizing the connectivity and the benefits of connections, these collaborations that are so important. Whatever your role is in life, we've all got something we can do to contribute to ocean protection, and then having the courage together to make a stand for the oceans and all the amazing species that live in them. So thank you again so much, and we hope to see you at a future GCT event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jen.